Okay. Really nice to see everybody here. And of course, I want to begin by thanking my hosts. I really appreciate the invitation to speak in this excellent and very timely series. And I also wanted to say thank you for allowing me to speak to you in English. I'm going to go slowly, slower than my normal rate. I hope that helps. And also because here, as elsewhere, I tend to write in more than one style. Sometimes more expository, sometimes more exegetical, and sometimes more poetic. And that latter mode is a way of trying to connect and intensify usually the film with which I'm working. In the knowledge that one never repeats the film, but there is something to the telling and the retelling that is a kind of remaking and a kind of emphasis that I want to be able to voice up. Okay. So this invitation, I also have to confess I have new contact lenses. I'm getting used to getting used to seeing differently. Okay, so the invitation to speak here today has also given me the prompt that I needed to begin new work. Begin work for what will be the last to be written chapter of the book that I'm completing. Although the problems that it addresses will be far from the concluding remarks of that book. Rather, the paper of today is the first presentation of work for what will be the second chapter. The book, which Carolyn named, Exposing Deconstructions, Animal and Sexual Differences, takes very seriously Jacques Derrida's invocation of hospitality towards animals. Hospitality towards animals, quote, on the threshold of sexual differences. This is a remark made in the middle of The Animal That Therefore I Am. It is an affirmative gesture of welcome in reference to his own work, to Derrida's own work, as it, quote, seems to become more autobiographical. It is an opening, not to the tyranny of the concept, but to differences that grow. And I think differences that grow is probably my most favorite quotation from any book at any time. And I'm very happy to return to that later because it's kind of operative all the time for me. I don't always flesh it out. But the idea that difference is something that grows. So this opening, this hospitable opening, not to the tyranny of the concept, but to differences that grow, animal differences that might take their leave from the conceptual means by which Western thought has and continues to carve an absolute distinction between the human and the animal. That means, this means of differentiation, has operated either by accruing ability or capacity on the side of the human and lack of ability or privation on the side of the animal, or assuming perfect, timeless adaptation on the side of the animal and initial weakness on the side of the human, that is destined to spur his technological as a dialectical overcoming of the world. And these are two sides of the same coin. They have the same outcome. Differences that grow dispense too with the conceptual habit of sexual difference, construed to be opposition, an opposition that amounts to the same, if we think about the work of Lucy Irigaray. The encounter then between human-animal studies and gender studies takes place in my current work on a substantially continental stage. If gender might more obviously speak to an Anglo-American sociological or anthropological frame, in order to orient myself here, I would briefly flag up the parallel investigations of the term Geschlechter in the work of both Donna Haraway and Derrida, given that both excavate the dissonant histories of the work of classification that Geschlechter performs across sex, race, species, and nation. Realize I wanted to just go on. So, in order to foster Derrida's welcome to differences that grow, a welcome I also see as feminist at heart, if not to the letter, my book explores core psychoanalytic formations along with cinematic case studies in depth. In today's case, both my choice of psychoanalytic formation, abjection, and Kristeva's work possibly in greater implication, and film present difficulties that for slightly different reasons need to be worked through. On the one hand, Julia Kristeva's work has come to attention within animal studies in light of Kelly Oliver's important intervention in the field through her 2009 book, Animal Lessons. Now, there is a great deal that I find to be helpful in Oliver's critical review of Kristeva, as well as other elements that I think need greater emphasis and follow-through in light of the governing frame within Kristeva of post-Lacanian psychoanalysis, no matter how much she kind of moves on from the work of Lacan. On the other hand, I write on or with a film that draws on both rape revenge and cannibal horror genres to viscerally oppose the patriarchal nuclear family. Now, it's not necessarily the viscera of genre that causes problems, but rather the definite article writ large in the very title of Lucky McKee's film, The Woman. Now, technically, there are several women in The Woman. While cinematic attention is particularly given to the feral one, captured in the woods by the film's leading man, who is subsequently chains her in the cellar, ostensibly framed as the family's civilization project, philosophical attention is arguably solicited with regard to the absolute quality or even archaic type that the instills, the definite article. Given the schematic cast and locations, we are also encouraged to see the country house in which the film is set as the house, the family as the family, and perhaps to pursue a spatial analysis of metaphysics as a gendered oikos or home economy. Yet, as I will argue, what sediments these categories is the implication that they are distilled in relation to the concept of the animal. To some, it might seem heavy-handed to cast the male lead in The Woman as both brutally patriarchal and a lawyer, to position one as the expression of the other. But in times when monsters do indeed walk the earth, when the so-called leader of the free world did not have his campaign for that position derailed by the film exposing his crude discussion of the sexual benefits of fame, a discussion infamously centering on the boast that he could grab 'em by the pussy, do anything, and amongst other numerous horrors, he went on to appoint a man credibly accused of sexual assault to the Supreme Court of the United States. In these times, I love The Woman. I feel like I should say something a little bit about my class as well. At Goldsmiths, I teach to third-year undergraduates, and I teach to an MA class as well. And with both, I've kind of accidentally trialed this material. I didn't know I was going to be writing about it until last year, and it transpired that it was going to be a paper. But in those classes, the MA class is called Sex, Gender, Species, and in today's difficult climate, It's frequently been the case that we've worked together on a film that is in some senses a rape revenge narrative with survivors of sexual assault. So in some ways also I speak to my friends and my students who are those survivors. And I wanted to not knock anything over. Because I am going to be talking about going in and out of theoretical questions around abjection, ways in which it is incredibly appealing in some senses, but also presents problems, theoretical, political, aesthetic problems to us. But also weaving in and out of this film, which I'm guessing that absolutely nobody has seen here, which I think is fine. I do want to show the cinematic trailer. And I also have a slide of the extremely schematic cast, so that if nothing else, you have the kind of the rudiments of, say, what is quite a kind of primal scene of a film. The house, the woman, the family, and not to mention the dogs, which I'll get onto. Right, so I'll come to the trailer momentarily, but we have. My slide of the cast. So starting top left, the mother, who's called Belle, the little girl who is becoming ever more fascinating for me, who's called Darlin, the pregnant teenager, Peggy, the woman, and on the bottom, the school teacher with the father. The surname of the family is Cleek, and the son, Brian. And on the bottom right, the creature that I do not know how to refer to, but I will be talking about, the anophthalmic creature. Okay, whoops, here we go. So, I don't know whether we checked volume.
Huh?
I don't know whether we checked volume.
Yeah, we did.
Okay, we did, great.
Did you already press play?
No, I didn't. Oh, but you did. Great.
Salt. At the dog shop. I'm going to school too.
So Dad, what do you want? I want a little man. Cheeseburger?
You'll see. This is our project. And it's a secret.
What are we gonna do with her?
We're gonna help her and train her, civilize her, free her from herself and her basic instincts. Everyone, keep your distance.
Are you sure you're not overextending?
Have you ever known me to let things get out of hand?
Do you really think we should be doing this? Do we really get to keep her?
Yeah.
Oh, my GIF doesn't work. Oh, damn. Yeah. Okay. I had a great GIF that I didn't make. I found it. What you need to know is our captive woman is dirted and blooded, and she is spitting out a ring. Okay, we'll come to this. First, I'm just going to read this citation. I'll put this down too. From the third chapter. No, the first chapter of Powers of Horror. So the abject confronts us, on the one hand, with those fragile states where man strays on the territories of animal. Thus, by the way of abjection, primitive societies have marked out a precise area of their culture in order to remove it from the threatening world of animals or animalism, which were imagined as representatives of sex and murder. The abject confronts us, on the other hand, and this time within our personal archaeology, with our earliest attempts to release the hold of maternal entity, even before existing outside of her, thanks to the autonomy of language. It is a violent, clumsy breaking away, with the constant risk of falling back under the sway of a power as securing as it is stifling. And the second citation, signification is what determines the human species. She bites off his finger. She bites off his ring finger. She swallows the flesh, but spits out the ring deliberately. Her first gesture when realizing her new situation as the restrained captive of the man who abducted her is to violently refuse the very sign of a heteropatriarchal economy of exchange. It is not worth eating. Teeth should not be this sharp. Mouth should not be that filthy. It's not right, surely. The film's dreamlike title sequence ambiguously shows the woman in the woods, possibly having been raised by wolves, when we see a baby with a wolf carefully licking blood from her fingers. We also see her stealing, even murderously stealing, the den of a wolf when she needs somewhere to hole up and nurse her injured flank. This mouth is not afraid of wolves. This mouth is not afraid of the unclean and improper. Although, quote, it is not lack of cleanliness or health itself that causes abjection, but what disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules, end quote. This mouth derides the signs of its own restraint. Returning to the epigraphs. To summarize my two epigraphs very strongly, to put it in the strongest terms, from texts written about 30 years apart, they index Kristeva's commitment to maintaining human exceptionalism as necessity in the post-Lacanian theory of subjectivity to which he has nevertheless significantly contributed. The first epigraph, now a regular citation in the narrow field of investigation that has sought a conversation between psychoanalysis and animal studies. It is from what I would argue remains Kristeva's most well-known work in the Anglophone world, Powers of Horror. And it symptomatically repeats what Derrida has called the question of the animal. That is to say, the animal, concept, the animal, is not her subject in the sense that it so self-consciously is for Derrida. Numerous times in The Animal That Therefore I Am, he will say, the animal is my subject. Even though one could also say that Differences That Grow is also his subject. And it's kind of a cruel of categories. So the animal is not Kristeva's subject, but rather it is her ground. The subject that she develops is psychoanalysis. The animal is a concept that she repeats. So this renders rather more forcefully Oliver's argument in the book, Animal Lessons, that revisited a range of scholars, very much in light of Derrida's work, to further flesh out the ways in which their works police the conceptual divide between the human and the animal. What is particularly salient about Oliver's substantial intervention in the still burgeoning interest in the resources of continental philosophy for animal studies is her demonstration that women scholars have also repeated this division. The scholars in question for Oliver are Simone de Beauvoir and Julia Kristeva, well respected as theorists of feminism and the feminine, respectively, and we should also note both part of the dialectical tradition. Oliver is keenly observant of the problematic ways in which sexual reproduction, negatively understood as the metonymy of animality, muddies the prospective clean transcendence of woman to the political sphere in Beauvoir, a trajectory that man nevertheless assumes that he can achieve. The abject taint of the latter's phrasing, Simone de Beauvoir's phrasing, and Oliver brings this out, it's really kind of stayed with me. The abject taint of the latter's phrasing, quote, the species gnaws at woman's vitals. Right. Gnaws, chews away, like an animal. The species gnaws at woman's vitals. Prefigures Oliver's revision of her extensive extant work on Kristeva, now to bring out the connected issue of the feminine and the animal. On this connection, let's return to the epigraph. Now, somewhat generalized engagements with abjection, say in the visual arts in the early 1990s, may have reduced it to a fear of border crossings, without regard for the anxieties that might prompt those fears. Closer readers of Kristevan abjection in the humanities, prior to Oliver's book, would certainly have noticed the second aspect of the confrontation with the abject, that which pertains to our personal archaeology, to our subjectivity, as the attempt to, quote, release the stifling hold of maternal entity by means of the autonomy of language. What Oliver's work incites us to reread is the division presented here between the subject's relation to the maternal and the social relation to, quote, the threatening world of animals. As with Oliver's tracing of the negatively troped animal figures that dog the emancipatory desire for the transcendence of the second sex in Beauvoir, Oliver causes us to notice that the fragile state of abjection is an animal territory onto which man strays. In other words, it is not the proper state or estate of man, or as Derrida would say, and in a phrase that I also love, the subject that calls himself man, in this gesture of kind of like awarding yourself a prize, the subject that calls himself man in distinction from the other that he calls the animal. There's a hugely kind of performative work that goes on in such a ostensibly simple phrasing. While an abject anxiety might be mobilized in myriad subsequent contexts of border collapse, and that phrasing, border collapse, is also to pass judgment on what should constitute a border, the foundational forces of abjection are double: the maternal, the animal. Now, the second epigraph, which is from Kristeva's 2010 article on the impudence of uttering, is here to index the enduring conservatism of psychoanalysis vis-à-vis the animal. This article came to my attention when I was trying to find any evidence of any impact of the proliferating continental embrace of the animal question in her work, since everyone, it now seems, wants to publish their animal book. In The Impudence of Uttering, Kristeva purposefully invokes the union of language, culture, and polymorphous perversity linked to creativity as that of the human species. She thinks this movement through the poetic work of Colette and Proust, and this is, of course, seductive, not least because the more mature Kristeva now writes on quote-unquote feminine genius and remarks on her own insistence that women are capable of sublimation, in distinction from Freudian orthodoxy. But readers should remain alert to her maintenance of the succession from nature to culture as that which humans alone can traverse. This is underlined when Kristeva briefly remarks on, quote, the nuptial dance without words, the nuptial dance without words of cats, as, quote, a displaced image of the envied parental coitus. The animal sensoriality of cats is wholly given over to the latter image, your parents having sex. Right? In this world, cats are purely vehicles for human desires that they clothe in a palatable fashion. I note this continued conservatism, given that some readers misread animal lessons, I think, as simply bringing Kristeva into the fold of animal studies. And I'm thinking particularly of Barbara Creed's recent essay on animals, art and abjection, included in a contemporary collection of new writing on the powers of horror, published last year, actually 2017, as well as some of Oliver's own subsequent writing that rather softens the critique that animal lessons has in fact made possible. Raising animals. Raising animals raises animals as our subject, as a subject that is not reducible to a symptom, that is not reducible to a figure, although animals may also figure as symptoms and as figures, and this is to recall Derrida's reminder that there is no sure way for readers to know whether his now infamous encounter with the little cat in his bathroom one morning is not also about Alice in Wonderland. He, after pages and pages of saying, really, my little cat, I'm really talking about my little cat, suddenly we're also talking about the hedgehog, the scenes of croquet. He doesn't mention the Cheshire Cat, but you kind of have it on the horizon. You just can't tell whether this entire domestic scene is not also invoking this other scene. So we need to raise animals to our attention now, in our time, the time of the sixth extinction, when they are under threat of erasure at an ever-increasing rate. And if I hadn't been here, I would have been on the Extinction Rebellion demonstrations in London, which loads of artists are involved in, and the pictures just look stunning, skeletons marching through central London. However, I am glad to be here too, so this is kind of like, also really glad to be here. However, to raise something to attention speaks to an anthropometric scale and sensorial form of attention, as it reveals something before us, or stands it before us, presented for our visual attention. The vertical and the visual come together in the way that we typically imagine human evolution. We are all too familiar with the ascent of man, diagrammed as the vertical ascension of a white man, walking into the future, away from his more horizontal, hairy, dark hominid ancestors. That diagram finds its psychoanalytic support in Freud's footnotes to Civilization and its Discontents. These footnotes suggest, quite famous footnotes, suggest that to the extent man becomes a standing animal, an erect animal, he becomes one that visually surveys his domain rather than smells the terrain. So I'll say that again, so fluffed it a little bit. Man becomes an animal that visually surveys his domain rather than smells the terrain, right, as an erect animal. And on this terrain, humans are those who raise animals, who practice animal husbandry in the particular agricultural sense, as well as in a way that is not necessarily fundamentally separate, in a philosophical sense of the management, the farming of concepts. Curiously unrelenting, this movement of elevation ascribed to the human is ingrained within the form of dialectical procedure as an overcoming itself, aufheben, and in French, relever, to raise up. In Raising Animals, I want to augment Oliver's caution regarding the double abjection of the animal and the feminine in Kristeva through the prism of this film, The Woman, which offers an acute, if troubling, meditation on these concepts. Now, while horror film might sound like an unlikely place in which to meditate on any concept, the genre has frequently invited just such philosophical work, and not least in questioning the morality of the family in such classics as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Barbara Creed's important work of feminist film theory, The Monstrous Feminine from 1993, notably invoked horror and the work of Kristeva as that which offered the possibility of the feminine as a power before the law of the father. Film further recalls the canonical feminist theorizations of gender from the 1970s and 1980s, and its critical appropriation of Claude Lévi-Strauss's anthropological equation of culture with the exchange of women between men, his elementary structures of kinship. I will thus take seriously Kristeva's own admission that her reflection upon the feminine will offer no solace, since, as she particularly emphasizes, it structurally cannot offer an alternative representation or alternative to representation. I'm going to come back to this structure. Okay. Have you fed the dogs yet? This anxious question is frequently repeated in The Woman, along with the agitated, demanding sound of barking. Somewhere we are given to understand there are hungry dogs, close to but never inside the house. They do not patrol the grounds of the house. They are not taken for walks. They do not accompany the father lawyer, Cleek, on his military-grade weaponry-equipped nocturnal hunting trips. The dogs never leave what I'm calling the kennel out of convention, but more descriptively, it's like a caged part of a large shed. Thus, any familiar signs of the domestication of dogs are scarce. They are not pets. They are not on guard. Has anyone fed them? If the category of companion species can be described as a mode of relating that situates those who eat with others, com panis, as Donna Haraway suggests, with bread, that companionship has been subjected to very tight controls. While everyone in the family knows about the dogs, refers to them as the dogs without ever invoking any individual name, and the daughter Peggy volunteers to feed them, we only ever see Cleek and his son doing so, and with a cruelty reducible to a law of accept food or get beaten. The shots that show this enclosure, until the closing sequence, remain shy of who or what is being fed beyond two leashed German shepherds in the kennel within the kennel at the rear of the enclosure. The sound of barking is not contained to the shed, but can be heard all around the property, including in the cellar in which the woman is restrained, pairing the liminal spaces of kennel and cellar. Both spaces belong to the house, but are peripheral to it. Both come with locks and chains and weaponry. The force with which these spaces are fortified contrasts with the depleted maternal figure within the house itself, in which Belle flinches at the mere sound of Cleek's raised voice. The kennel and cellar may be secretive spaces, but all family members are psychically bound to them in various relations of fear and fascination. Unlike the inhabitants of the kennel, all family members are both shown the woman, and we are shown their various reactions to her, her condition, and their own role in maintaining it. When Cleek takes his family down into the cellar to see their civilization project, the woman, he warns them not to get too close because she likes to bite, and shows them his severed finger. Yes. We can't have people going around the woods thinking they're animals, he says. It isn't right. It's not safe. While Darlin, the little girl, reacts curiously to this threat of devourment by both bending her finger as if she too had lost part of it and smacking her lips as if she were the one biting a finger off and swallowing it. Cleek explains that this is a secret project that they would all share in looking after and keeping hidden, adding that it's just like the dogs. Secreted away from the public, the family know about the dogs. They are raising them after all, even as this familiar name fetishistically grasps what the kennel actually houses. Relatively restrained overall as a horror film, The Woman saves its biggest shock, in line with genre expectations of mounting horror and escalating violence, for the penultimate revelation for the audience of just what has been going on with the dogs for all this time, the duration of the film, but perhaps a wider conception of time as such, with the dogs taking on a phantasmatic sense of a perpetually ravenous beast that must be fed to be contained, but whose hunger can never be sated, whose jaws are always open. If an anxiety-laden duty surrounds the kennels, a duty that has nevertheless become quotidian every day, fear and fascination envelops the cellar and the woman it restrains. Belle, the mother, is fascinated with her strength, almost on her side, but fatally fails to help the woman when she has the chance, being unable to overcome her terror of Cleek. Peggy is aghast at the situation, brave enough to at least intervene when the woman is being brutally washed with a power hose. And she is the one who will finally release the woman when there is no other force for help possible. Like his father, Brian implicitly understands that this ostensible project of civilization would not exclude her sexual abuse, immediately asking, "Do we really get to keep her?" Later, Brian takes sadistic pleasure in her captivity, spying on his father's late-night visit and rape of the woman, and subsequently returning to inspect her to the point of torture himself. It is Peggy that puts a stop to his cruel investigation of her breasts. Meanwhile, Darlin places her new toy radio outside the cellar door so that the captive might enjoy some music, like she does. So what we designate as feminine, as Christeva, far from being a primeval essence, will be seen as an other without a name. And from Derrida, the feminine beast and the masculine sovereign. So what? So who? Above or beyond the law, alternatively in violation of it, the political figures of the beast and the sovereign seem to form two distinct poles while sharing what Derrida names a troubling resemblance, this being outside the law, this reciprocal haunting. Indeed, this uncanny proximity cannot but be heard in the French title of Derrida's seminars, La Bête et le Souverain, where the differences between A and A, is and an, remain inaudible. So the beast and the sovereign, the beast is the sovereign. The potential substitutability of the beast for the sovereign is a murderous substitution, where, quote, man is a wolf to man, he is a lethal threat. Such is the thicket of animal figures, especially wolves, or the wolf in particular, in political discourse, that Derrida can weave between Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Sigmund Freud, and Little Red Riding Hood in a matter of lines. The recurrence of the lexicon of devourment, he says, is common to all, to political theory, to psychoanalysis, to fairy tales. Derrida cautions us not to forget the she-wolf. For example, she that suckled the twins Romulus and Remus at the foundations of Rome. His French pauses on the gendered inflections of la and le, the female beast and the masculine sovereign. Repeating this inflection frequently across the seminars, although perhaps without enough development, certainly enough to pique the interest of feminist readers, but perhaps not enough for the majority of his readers to make it unavoidable. Derrida's use here of what and who recalls his much earlier interview called Eating Well from the mid-1980s, in which he first explicitly addressed the question of the animal and the death sentence it ultimately commands between those designated a who or a thou who shalt not be killed, while the implied what is pushed outside of ethical consideration and may be put to death without criminal offence. This is not Derrida's affirmation. This is his diagnosis of enduring problems, even within our most sophisticated theories of ethics or philosophies of ethics. Just as the animal was diagnosed as the conceptual corral, Derrida uses the term corral, that we must undo. The beast in his seminars does not engage with living animals in any detail, but does refer us to the consequences of our bestial imaginary for the living. This mouth must be cleaned up, must be taught to eat properly, to eat cooked food and to say the words, thank you. This mouth must be taught to exchange food for words. Cleaning up the cellar, under Cleek's instruction, the family follow that instruction, but with varying degrees of compliance and hesitation regarding the oddness of this sudden order. Only the little girl, Darlin, is excited. Perhaps there are mice. She should get some cheese. Belle, the mother, makes cookies for her children. On request, they are gingerbread men. Would the animal lady like to eat a little man? Darlin says, generously. Her thought of a gift giving the animal lady a little man. Her thought of a gift condensing oral and genital, cannibalism, identification, and impregnation. Belle blocks contact. Affirming the law and the straight lines of identification, she says that it is her father who is helping the woman. Certainly not giving her anything. While the core image of powers of horror that sticks, remains in the academic imagination, might be Kristeva's opening reference to the skin on the surface of milk, inducing the urge to vomit. The book's third chapter on filth and defilement obliges us to return to the cultural primal scenes of the Freud of totem and taboo. That text, as we may know, vacillates on whether our ancestors were an animal or the father, incrementally crafting the way to installing the father at the origins, with animals only ever serving as substitutes for that patriarch. Filth and defilement also makes the encounter with the feminine and the animal unavoidable. At the very end of his text, Freud consolidates the beginning that totem and taboo dramatizes. Quoting Goethe, he writes, "In the beginning was the deed." Kristeva observes that by this ending, one could be forgiven for forgetting that two crimes announced the origins of culture in Freudian legend: the murder and cannibalism of the father and incest with the mother. The latter disappears, even though the attempt to explain the severity of incest dread had driven Freud's investigations into the paucity of anthropological accounts of culture, in his view, and even though it is the apparent motivation for the foundational patricide. Immediately, Kristeva is clear that she does not dispute Freud's account of this patricide. She does not dispute it. She's saying something extra, but Freud, for her, is quite clear. He's bang on, he's correct. She refers to the privileged setting of this patricide as, quote, the keystone to the desire henceforth known as Oedipal. This is important to note, since Oliver sometimes can give the impression that Kristeva's attention to the mother diminishes the investment in the father that Freud consecrates. Rather than redress his lack of attention to this other structure, rather, Kristeva expands on what she considers to be the two-sided formation of the sacred. Sacred, given that this formation of law is bound up with that of religion. These two sides, this two-sided formation, however, are radically different in kind and in consequence. There is, quote, one aspect founded by murder and the social bond made up of murder's guilt-ridden atonement with all the projective mechanisms and obsessive rituals that accompany it, and another aspect like a lining, more secret still and invisible, non-representable, oriented towards those uncertain spaces of unstable identity, toward the fragility, both threatening and fusional, of the archaic dyad, toward the non-separation of subject-object, on which language has no hold, but one woven of fright and repulsion. Now both sides, both of these two sides, hold negative affects. But as she continues, one aspect is defensive and socializing, the other shows fear and indifferentiation. Paternal murder founds the law that begins with a thou shalt not kill, and hence the possibility of a social world, defending against murderous lawlessness. Maternal incest threatens a relapse. What is both a temptation and a problem for feminist readers is that while we may desire the end of the law as authorized by the father, this framework holds that this other aspect cannot offer a replacement. It is non-representable. Prior to turning a little bit more to this temptation, I want to be clear about the structure that Kristeva nevertheless maintains. She writes that if the murder of the father, Freudian legend, also as it transposes into structural anthropology, if the murder of the father is that historical event constituting the social code as such, that is, symbolic exchange and the exchange of women, its equivalent on the level of the subjective history of each individual is therefore the advent of language, which breaks with perviousness, with permeability, if not with the chaos that precedes it, and sets up denomination as an exchange of linguistic signs. There is thus a distinction between the category of women in the sense of tokens of exchange, a sign amongst other signs given order by the paternal signifier, and the feminine that can produce no sign of its own. Moreover, this invocation of the social code as such, as the exchange of women between men, is inextricable from the advent of language, and hence the exchange of linguistic signs, speaking not only to Freud, a Freud that Kristeva more frontally addresses, but also to the structural anthropology of Claude Lévi-Strauss. Now, unlike Gail Rubin's demand for a revolution in kinship, in her canonical essay from 1975, The Traffic in Women, Kristeva does not counter Lévi-Strauss. The long epigraph that I previously discussed from the opening pages of Powers of Horror sketch two axes, the social abjection of animals and the subject's abjection of the maternal. Yet at the point where Kristeva introduces the two-sided sacred, with the caveat that what we designate as feminine, far from being a primeval essence, will be seen as an other without a name, animals have sunk below even this non-status, seemingly not able to be raised even as nameless. The two powers that Kristeva directly invokes, powers that attempted to share out society, are masculine and feminine. One of them, she says, is apparently victorious. But through its very, quote, relentlessness against the other, it reveals that it is, quote, threatened by an asymmetrical, irrational, wily, uncontrollable power, end quote. This is a locution that appeals to us, that calls out to us, speaks almost in the manner of leftist appropriations of the master-slave dialectic, in which the bondsman, whose very work, compelled though it might be, promises to eventually enable him to rise up in triumph over the lord whose might is ironically belied by his non-labouring body. For Kristeva, however, this asymmetrical, irrational, wily, uncontrollable power cannot absolutely overcome the one whose name and whose economy of exchange is defensive and socializing, despite being no less virulent. To the Anglophone ear, however, wiliness perhaps conjures up a seductive animal style, the cleverness of an animal primed to outsmart rivals, threats, or prey. Thus, while the noun animal does not appear in this section on the two powers, the phrasing perhaps bears its figural implication. Where the concept of the animal is at work, however, in metaphysics, in dialectics, animals will struggle to exceed that figural implication. While it is the frontal argument of Freud in Totem and Taboo to position patricide as the origin of culture and or as the law, it is Derrida that pursues the logical implications of this for non-human animals. Not only can animals never rise to symbolic status within the law themselves, but they can never commit an infraction of the law. Animals are never criminals. And again, this is not something that Derrida affirms. This is the law as he reads it and of which he is critical within psychoanalysis, and particularly the psychoanalysis of Jacques Lacan in the Écrit. Pursuing this logic as it arises in Lacan, Derrida continues his lamentation that this will also mean that no criminal offence is committed against animals as such, even when their bodies allegorize the encounter between men. Now, just as Derrida has asked, what would happen to fraternity, to the social imagined as a fraternity? Should a sister or an animal enter it? We might also ask what would happen to psychoanalysis if we are to follow ethological curiosity and allow that non-human animals may produce other laws, other cultures, not necessarily commensurate with human law. Will our case fall when it no longer sits in place as the case, when it is not a matter of raising all abjected others to the same status, but that the field of our encounters demands other architectures? Where there is food, there is also a polluting object. At the boundary between nature and culture, between the human and the non-human, Kristeva tells us, all food is liable to defile. Cleaning up means dealing with the dirt and the frailty of symbolic order. The sudden organisation of the cellar is absolutely under Cleek's direction, from cleaning the space to cleaning up after the woman. This undertaking in civilization raises the game of both mere housework and maternally identified toilet training. Brian, the son, is seconded to both of these dirty tasks. He is quietly, if resentfully, compliant in the cellar. In the kennel, feeding the unseen inhabitant of the cage within the cage, he accidentally puts his hand in her shit. In resentment and disgust, he calls her a bitch. Feeding the dogs and cleaning up after this bitch in the enclosed, sectioned off spaces, Brian is yet contaminated by shit. Legible as the metonymy of the attempt to control corporeal orifices, these spaces will never be clean. Resentful of his delegation to cleaning duties, and especially the accident that sullies him with shit in echo of his own sphincteral training, Brian returns to the breast. He returns not to nourish himself on food, but to exact punishment upon the woman, refusing the breast as that which provides milk and obliging it to surrender blood. So a kind of complex and difficult quotation here from Kristeva. Not that the rest were a walk in the park, but this is difficult in a way that I'm probably going to be committed to writing about and trying to unravel for the next 2 months. Maternal authority is the trustee of the mapping of the self's clean and proper body. It is distinguished from paternal laws within which, with the phallic phase and acquisition of language, the destiny of man will take shape. Now we are primed. We are primed to expect the defensive structures that architecturally and psychically map out the space of the house and its abjected outbuildings, the cellar and the kennel, to be breached. We are primed to expect this breaching to emerge from the interior to be a breaking out more than a breaking in. It is a horror film. Bolting a door will never bolt the danger out, but always lock it in. Narrative expectation has focused upon the woman, and while a stranger, her naming in the form of the definite article invites us to expect and to desire an eruption of the feminine within this patriarchal fortification. Now, while that desire is indeed given dramatic expression, a sucker punch comes from a surprise source. Anophthalmia. The medical term is so unfamiliar, and the eruption of violence that accompanies its utterance seizes our attention. It is so eye-catching that it is easy to miss anophthalmia. Belle, the mother, prompts its first usage when she loses her temper at long last with Cleek. At long last. She is completely incensed by his refusal to agree that Brian has done anything wrong and deserves any punishment. Boys will be boys, Cleek says. In the ensuing argument, Belle defends the rights of the woman, specifically as those of a human being, while suddenly making reference to what is going on with the goddamn dogs. It's enough to put you in prison. Cleek responds, highly cryptically for us, by saying the word anophthalmia, followed directly by your shame. Thus the metonymic chain of the woman, the dog's congenital blindness, the mother, is made to cluster around her shame. If there is a threatening secret, it is all her fault, he says. I think I might have got 2 images for this. Oh no, we keep that back. In the epigraph of this section, my italics added emphasis, emphasizing the distinction Kristeva's understanding of language implements, the distinction between mapping and laws. speaking of a primal mapping that shapes the body into a territory, having areas, orifices, points and lines, surfaces and hollows, where the archaic power of mastery and neglect, of the differentiation of proper clean and improper dirty, possible and impossible, is impressed and exerted. In Kristavan psychoanalysis, these impressions map territory, but do not write the law. The law separates discrete elements, including paradigmatically, as we've heard, women and words, and represses any maternal authority that would take matters into its own hands. Rights attempt to manage the border between the semiotic of the body and the word of the law, from right, R-I-T-E, to right, R-I-G-H-T. Not simply filth, but defilement, come to be what Kristeva calls the translinguistic spore of our most archaic boundaries with the mother, the objection of which is given salve through ritual, is eased through ritual. Again, animality leaves a figural trace in Kristeva's prose, translinguistic spore, with perhaps an ambivalence towards both the scholar on whom she has published extensively and also towards the animals from whom she would learn. Kelly Oliver notes that it is, quote, the animal that puts the teeth into Kristeva's notion of the abject devouring mother. Holding on to this bite, even as Oliver knows that what puts the bite into this animal is a figure of carnivory. Now, in a film as primal as this, with the severance of Cleek's finger early in its narrative, swallowed as inconsequential flesh with the ring rejected, we might expect that carnivory will resume. In that troubling resemblance of beast and sovereign, Derrida reminds us that both stand outside or above the law. Ruling the household, Cleek feels utterly immune from incrimination up to and including murder. He cannot tolerate being told that he can't do anything, and repeats the word in rising tones as he strikes Belle to the floor. Domestic violence is orchestrated precisely around Cleek's absolute intolerance of not being able. And this is the precise quality that, as Derrida notes, the virile figure of carno-phallogocentrism claims to possess. Man is always the one who can speak, who can reason, who is able. The word can't and the flare of anger it triggers repeats when Peggy tries to stop Cleek's subsequent assault upon her schoolteacher. After the second woman, the teacher, challenges Cleek's authority within his own home, as he says, with her inquiry after Peggy's pregnancy, the film's rapidly shifting final sequence of punishment and retribution, all of which involve forms of cannibalism, is unleashed. The dogs are really barking now. Their agitation is heard across the film's cuts between the schoolteacher being dragged towards the kennel, Belle coming around in the kitchen, and the woman pulling at her restraints in the cellar. In the montage of reactions to the rising sense of panic, Darlin asks, "Mama, what's happening to the doggies?" She is the only one to ever refer to the dogs with affection. The film immediately cuts to the terror of the teacher about to be fed to them. And we are still under the impression that these are only brutalized dogs. The second time we hear what is likely still an utterly mysterious word, Cleek derisively asks the teacher, now thrown to the dogs, literally and figuratively, whether she can say anophthalmia, repeating the word with derisive enunciation. Stressing each syllable, Cleek identifies his elocution with the circulation of discrete units, with signs, with the paternal signifier as the one which organizes the social. The word itself names the blind spot of sexual difference as philosophically concatenated with the concept of the animal. As unpleasantly voyeuristic as he has been throughout, Brian seemingly addresses the dogs, saying, "Let's see what you can do." On the one hand, the film rapidly cuts between all simultaneous action taking place, with each protagonist in such a way as to magnify the tension and the horror. It's a genre that is hardly going to respect the law, "thou shalt not kill." On the other hand, one of the most psychically challenging matches on action occurs when the woman is finally freed by Peggy, and of the two spaces that Belle could possibly stagger towards, she chooses to go to the cellar, thinking that the open door is the cause of the chaos. The film now reveals the family's other secret, the eldest daughter, kept crouched and snarling at the back of the kennel, raised as one of the dogs, raised in the same ravenous state, living entirely to eat, in anticipation of live food without regard for what is good. The woman matches this obscene instrumentalization of the animal and the feminine as the beast woman is set upon the teacher, with Peggy setting the woman loose only for her to run straight into Belle. Now, in terms of the narrative, we can understand the woman taking revenge on Belle, the woman who failed to help her when she could have made a stand, shocking as this scene is. But in light of Kristeva and Freud and the way in which culture is a form of repetition of these primal scenes, in light of the identification that ingestion awards, including paradigmatically through cannibalism, it makes sense that when the woman kills Belle, she eats her face. She eats her face, takes her place. Suddenly, the kennel is no longer a space in which a bloody spectacle can be secured on one side of the cage only, nor designated as that over which men have authorial control. Appearing in the door to the kennels covered in the mother's blood, the woman swiftly fells Brian with a sharp piece of metal. As her teeth were strong enough to sever his finger earlier in the film, now her bare hand can penetrate Cleek's torso and pull out his beating heart. Taking a cursory bite, the woman lets the now truly heartless father collapse. Consistent with the dogs, the film gives no diegetic name to the sightless creature that, sniffing the air, follows the woman out of the kennels on all fours. I don't know what to call her, how best to refer to her. The credits and script refer to her as Socket. No eyes, only sockets, rendered in the singular, Socket. It's already a kind of pet name, a diminutive, suggestive of a sock puppet. Perhaps anophthalmia is her proper name, rooting her in congenital blindness. The sucker punch, the boxing move that lands on an opponent subsequent to the one that was only a bluff, turns into a socket punch, a wound inflicted upon the eyes, in imagery for which the psychoanalytic mainstay of castration is unavoidable. Rooting this difference in disability, in casting difference from the subject that calls himself man as the one who is able, points to the virulence of Cleek's reaction against being told that he can't. Slowing right down to a more gentle pace and tone, Socket then emerges slowly, with curiosity, into the fresh air, in which we can assume that she has never before encountered. Two gestures, in this final sequence, rapidly re-choreograph the domestic theatre of raising animals. Released from the cellar, the woman's vertical ascension into the light and into her bloody substitution of herself for the face and the heart of the family contrasts with Socket's off-leash, ostensible freedom. With two spaces of containment sundered and two captives liberated, together with the shock that one of the dogs was another daughter, one might expect them both to transcend their conditions. However, only the animal in the cellar returns to light. The woman sees Socket and sees her not as someone to be returned to humanity, but as an animal to be domesticated. Economically, with one swift strike to Socket's head, issued with the hand holding the heart rather than the one with the improvised sword, the woman retains her within an imminent pethood, rewarded with that same heart now downgraded to the status of scraps. The second gesture, also achieved economically in a speechless scene, occurs when the woman approaches the house, with Socket now ambling along at her heel. Darlin rushes out to greet the woman into Peggy's palpable terror. And we should note that Darlin has been consistently addressed with this diminutive throughout the film, never as Darlene. But Darlin fearlessly offers this guest a drink of water in perfect hospitality, having never seen her as a hostage. She gulps it down, but pays no attention to the blood smeared all over her face and hands. When to bite and when to lick. The woman offers her bloody finger to Darlin, and the girl, the very one who mimed Cleek's injury in the cellar, licks the blood and smacks her lips. I have to say, this is not done in an overly and obviously salacious way, but nevertheless it is profoundly shocking. She doesn't bite. She's learned not to bite. Brought together thus, we can raise doubts about the new family heading off into the woods. In part, the film productively troubles the fraternal account of law that Kristeva affirms when she writes, quote, "Fear of the uncontrollable generative mother repels me from the body. I give up cannibalism because abjection of the mother leads me towards respect for the body of the other, my fellow man, my brother." While insofar as it anchors this new family around the domestication of a pet, rooted in a condition that cannot be helped, While insofar as the film anchors this new family around the domestication of a pet, rooted in a condition that cannot be helped, is seemingly inevitably lesser, the question of the animal remains. Coda. We'll see if this link works in a moment. As if in acknowledgement of the visceral and murderous character of the film's denouement, the woman has a secret ending. After all the credits have rolled, in a location ambiguously inside and outside the film, an animated, cartoon-like fairy tale sequence returns us to Darlin, as if the mobile psychic journey of the little girl was or should have been central all along. As she does within the body of the film, Darlin greets terrifying others fearlessly. In this case, she can give, again, no name, I don't know what to call her, it, this tree woman beast creature. Darlin can give the tree woman beast flowers without having to lay them outside her locked door. In this case, no blood flows, but gestures are exchanged, and the two creatures look at each other with a smile. Now, we will see
I'm sorry. I don't
Okay. Okay, we can't see it, so it's slightly mysterious, even more mysterious. Suffice me to say, the little girl voyaging, going off on a track in which she wants to meet, wants to find, and encounters this unidentifiable, like, beast tree woman. And they end up with this gesture of smiling and flowers in her hair. So, and that's the point on which I would like to close. Thank you.